Welcome to All Creatures Podcast. This is Chris. Really excited today to introduce author Elizabeth Kolbert. First, Elizabeth, welcome to the All Creatures Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I was just telling you when your name came across my email, I jumped at it right away with your publicist because I am a big fan of yours. Your book, The Six Extinction and Unnatural History, had really impacted me when I was a professor back in the United States, doing research with endangered species, really touched me. And I've told your stories throughout this podcast the last going on, 8 years. And so when they approached me and said, would you have her on the podcast with your new book, Life on a Little Known Planet? Yes, absolutely. Jumped on it. When can we book her? Can you get me the book as quick as you can? And I started diving in right away. And I did go back and actually read The Sixth Extinction again, just to refresh my memory. You are just an incredible writer. And just to give a little bit of your bio to our listeners is, you're one of the most well-respected environmental journalists. You started your writing career a long time ago, but really notable for the New Yorker for the last 26 years, where you focused a lot on climate change, this biodiversity crisis we find ourselves in, consequences of human activity. And The Sixth Extinction won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, which was not unsurprising to me. It was just so impactful. You also wrote Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, which was published just a few years ago. That is next on my to read list. And then Life on a Little Known Planet, which drops the 5th of November in 2025. And for our listeners, you want to read these books if you haven't. I'm sure many of you probably have, but you want to get a glimpse because what these stories do is it gives you highlights all around the planet. And, Elizabeth hadn't been here in New Zealand, just a few miles from where I live now, in one of her stories. So, Elizabeth, just to jump into it, because I don't want to do all the talking, but in the Sixth Extinction book, because that title was so striking to me, because I was in the heat of it, and I explained to you, when I was a professor, seeing study after study published in Nature and all these top journals, where the alarm bells were ringing. We're in this sixth mass extinction. And I saw your book get published and I bought it right away. And it really impacted me, really hit me hard that all these different areas of the planet were suffering due to human activity. So that inspired me to work harder. And then eventually this podcast with Angie. But this one, Life on a Little Known Planet, you kind of shift a little bit because it gives us hope, right? Like, what kind of spurred you with that? Because I know we always talk about hope. We need hope, but these are some incredible stories you're telling and giving insight into how we may get out of this. So what drove you to kind of make that change?
Well, I don't, I can't say there's really a change. I mean, I think that the stories in Life on a Little Known Planet focus often on people who are really trying to make a difference, some very well-known people and also some people, that even your listeners will never have heard of. And I think that, to whatever extent that the book is inspiring, and I hope that there are inspiring stories in there, it comes from the energy of these people who are really, really trying to do something. And the book really looks at, interesting ideas and out there ideas and people who are just completely committed to doing everything that they can. Sort of like you, what can I do?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and we get that question all the time, like, what can I do? Especially from the Gen Z, like the young generation that you're hearing story after story. They have climate anxiety. They look to the future with despair. I told this story a few weeks ago. My 10-year-old son driving in the car with his friend said, "Oh, Dad, there's not going to be a world left for me." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he was, climate change and all these different issues. So knowing that, as and I talked to him. I said, nobody, you know what dad does. And there's many people behind me uh, and around the planet working hard to preserve what we have. In I guess I would start with life on a little known planet, because you do talk about a little bit in your other books, but is there a story in there that just gave you the most hope? You were just like, okay, I've got to write about this.
Well, I mean, honestly, when you start out to set out to write a story, it's always you have to every story you do just to get up the sort of requisite energy and enthusiasm. Every story is like, oh, I've got to write this. So it's a little bit like your kids. You don't want to pick favorites, but the first story in the book is about people who are trying to decode the language of sperm whales. That was an amazing experience. And the second story in the book is about a guy who is really racing to catalog every caterpillar uh, in the U.S. And I went out with him, and we found really interesting new species, new genera. So every one while you're doing it is kind of your favorite.
Mhm. Well, it brought me back to in your other book you wrote about, and I just talked about this on a podcast, where in the Brazilian rainforest, the plots, right, where the clear forest, and then the loss of biodiversity and the insects, and that really blew me away, because the scientists I think you were talking to said there could be up to 30 million species of insects around the world. We just don't know. We haven't cataloged them all. And when they go and clear this part of the forest, how many of those species are gone forever? And it's really hard hitting. So in these stories, and you're seeing this, how, I guess as a writer, how do you present that information? That because as a scientist, we're used to writing a certain way that's very factual, XYZ, and this and this. But as a very talented writer, how do you present that information to somebody that doesn't turn them off, but makes them want to read it all and absorb it, and then maybe take action?
Well, I think what I've tried to do, and obviously readers will have to decide for themselves, is um not just yes, there are a lot of tough messages, obviously in a book called The Sixth Extinction, but there's also a lot of fascinating information and fascinating people, fascinating creatures. So I think that I try to make it as interesting. The world is just really, really an interesting place. That's why the title "Life on a Little Known Planet." There's so much, which I should also say is borrowed or taken from a book that appeared in the '60s, and if you read the book, you'll understand, sort of why, by an entomologist who was really, really concerned about, what was happening right beneath our feet, this uncatalogued world of insect life, even really, um, uh insects that people don't like, silverfish
Mhm.
and, you know, um, mites and things that but they are all, every species, when you think about it, is really an answer to the great question of how to survive on planet Earth. Every species has worked out a survival strategy, and they're all different in some way, and that's just amazing. And we should appreciate that. And when people, ask, why should I care if that mite or whatever went extinct? Um, that's my answer. That was an answer to how to survive on planet Earth, and that's gone now. Um, and when you think about it that way, I think it does sort of tilt your worldview.
That's really funny you say that, because when I started this work, at the university, I joined the wildlife club as an advisor, and I would give a talk every semester, and I still give this talk. I've given it remotely to universities around the world. I do. I actually have to go next week here in New Zealand and give this talk again about the crisis we're in, right? The sixth mass extinction. And you say, who cares about that mite? I have this a clip. It's old, from a newspaper clipping in the UK from around the time I put this together. So maybe, 2010, 11. And there's all the lost wildlife of the United Kingdom. The brown bear and the lynx, and they're trying to reintroduce some of this, the beaver. But there's this tawny earwig. And I always highlight that one. And I say, like the great auk, I tell that story about how tragic that was. But the tawny earwig, I said, nobody cares about that tawny earwig. But let me tell you who does. The hedgehog that eats that tawny earwig. The tawny earwig is actually eating little mites, eating some of these other plants. It has its purpose. And when it's gone, you remove that out of the ecosystem. Now the hedgehog has to go and eat something else. And then something else has to come in and try to eat those plants that the tawny earwig was eating. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Every creature on this planet has carved out a niche, and we've cohabitated until really the last, few hundred years, where human, has had this impact. So I want to ask you, in the sixth extinction, is there a story in there that still haunts you, and you're still, churns your stomach, and you're like, "Ooh," it was just a tough one to cover?
Well, you mentioned the great auk story, and that one was really, I do think about that fairly often. The great auk was this magnificent, flightless bird in the Northern Hemisphere, one of the only flightless birds in the Northern Hemisphere. Pretty big, about 3 feet tall. You can see them in museum collections. They survive long enough that there are many stuffed ones around. Um, and when you go back and read about what people did, I mean, they literally, use them for fuel. These birds would occupy these islands that then became stopover spots for cod fishing in general, before we wiped out most of the cod. And
Yeah.
they, were considered great, fresh meat to take on these voyages. But in addition to that, people just did, astonishingly awful things. They used the birds themselves as fuel, just toss them on a fire. They were kind of fatty, and use killed slaughtered them for feathers. They just
Mm,
absolutely, and this was a time when, I don't wanna say, yeah, I mean, people should have known better, and it was clear that
mm.
they were declining, and, you know, by the time anyone looked up to pay attention, they were gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell that story because from your book, I've used that, and how the last mating pair in Iceland, the name of the island, but they rode out, and they broke the egg that they were trying to hatch and killed them both, and
Yeah,
that's it. And the
yeah,
species gone,
yeah.
and
Yes,
they
and
were
it's very
just, yeah,
rare that you
yeah,
have so much, you know, information about the last days of a species. I mean, it is just a very, very well chronicled event.
yeah, yeah. That one, okay, yeah, that one is in there, and the other one that really stuck with me, and I've talked about this for years, is how trees are migrating up the mountain due to climate change, due to it's getting hotter, and some trees are able to, and others are not, and they'll go extinct. And then we look at the Joshua tree. They think that might go extinct because all the young ones can't survive in the heat. Yeah, it. But let's bring some hope. Let's talk about the AI one, because I think it was Bill Wallauer. We just interviewed him a couple months ago. It was sadly before Jane Goodall passed away. We spoke to him just a few weeks, but he was her filmographer for many decades. And we were talking about the good work that she was doing. And I think he mentioned AI decoding language. How, uh, what, I mean, you write about it in the book with the sperm whales, which is incredible. Where are we going with that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. It's at this point a bit of an open question because,
Hmm.
you know, one of the the power of AI, obviously, and anyone who's ever used ChatGPT can attest to this, is if you feed it vast amounts of data, it can find patterns and just basically repeat those patterns, and it's extremely good at that. And we have a lot of data to feed it. It's scraped, the whole web. but the quest is then you get the question with animals. First of all, you have to collect the data. So that's a challenge, but that's, presumably doable. But then you do have the issue of linking it to something. What is it? So you might, one of the interesting things that people talk about in computer scientists, there's some very, very eminent computer scientists attached to this project with sperm whales. One of the things that they talked to me about was this possibility that you would be able to get sort of pattern recognition, and you would be able to, create a whale conversation, as it were, the same way, ChatGPT or a bot can have a conversation with you. Um, but would you be able to understand it? So so that's a really interesting question. There's a really interesting question about how do you test it? How do you know that you've arrived at a right answer? It's really hard to ask, the whales. So all of these are really, really interesting questions. It raises interesting ethical questions, about communicating with other species. So it's a pretty fascinating realm. Now, I would say that no one yet has announced, oh, we have, people talk about like, a whale dictionary or whatever. I don't know if we're going, I guess at the end of the day, the fundamental question is, do we know that these animals are communicating, but are they communicating in a way that translates into words? And that is a
Yes.
really hard question to answer at this point.
Yeah, no, but as much as AI is scary in a sense, especially with like looking at employment and jobs. One hand, I know in conservation, not just that blew me away when I started learning that, and then when I read it in your book and sperm whales, and I'm just like, wow, like it just your mind goes crazy the possibilities, but using AI on ships to avoid whales, with cameras, thermal cameras, and directs the ship through predicting the whale's route. AI is being used in camera traps, because you get thousands and thousands of images. They're able to identify different tigers and different, certain animals. So there is a place in conservation where I think AI is going to help. Um, I guess that can kind of lead me into this one I wanted to ask you. Your travels to Greenland, because you're traveling all over the world, so you're living the dream, even though you're covering things that are pretty tragic in some sense, but you're seeing from New Zealand to Greenland to Europe to that small island off Denmark, rigid, freezing. But there's a chapter in there with Greenland, and this one really, really stuck with me. Again, life on a little known planet. And it was Dr. Eric
Yeah,
Renault.
yeah.
And yeah, and he was talking about the Antarctic ice sheet. And that's one we've been watching. And if that collapses like they think it will, it is being cut under with the ocean and the warming, that's going to raise sea levels by 4 feet. So I've done this. I've gone to the NOAA sea level rise predictor, and you can play with it at least on the coastal of the United States. And online, you can go and you put 4 feet. And I go and I look, because I used to live in Florida. So I go and look at Miami, and Miami's partially submerged. South Beach is gone. I go up the coast to Charleston. I go up to the coast to New York. Parts of Manhattan are a little bit underwater. Parts of North Carolina flooded. Virginia. So you covered that. So I want to ask you about that. But then the next couple chapters, you go to Miami, and then some of the predictions are off the chart, where they're predicting 6.5 feet. Some geologists you wrote predicting over 10 feet. And I looked at 10 feet, and DC's gone. Washington, DC's gone. If the seas go 10 feet, the worst predictions from some scientists by 2100. So and you do a beautiful job talking about thermal expansion of the water, whatnot. So going to Greenland, seeing this with your eyes, talking to the people on the ground, what is the sense of where we are today with it?
Well, Greenland, I have been back to Greenland since I wrote that piece that appears in Life in a Little Known Planet. I think the sense in Greenland is, among scientists who look at it, from a variety of angles, including, tons and tons of satellite data now, is that it's very close to this point where it's survival. It survives in part because it is in good measure because it is so huge. It's so high at the top of the Greenland ice sheet that it's 10,000 feet tall, and so 2 miles of ice. And at that elevation, you should never get liquid precipitation, but recently they have gotten liquid precipitation all the way at the top of the ice sheet. And once you start to melt an ice sheet, an ice sheet takes a long, long time to grow, and it's limited by how much snow falls. But once you start to melt it, there's almost, I don't want to say no limit. There are, sort of geophysical limits on how fast you can melt it, but it can melt a lot faster than it formed. And once you start sort of propagating that heat through the ice sheet via rain, for example, um, you know, things can take an ugly turn. So I think
Mhm.
people are very worried that the Greenland ice sheet, as it has sat there, more or less, um, since the end of the last ice age, is, you know, getting to a point where you're going to start getting these feedback loops that,
Mhm.
I don't want to say doom it, but mean that it's going to continue to shrink. There's pretty much no doubt about that. And that, you know, where the next stable state is for it. Is it, a much smaller ice cap? Those are all questions that are very, very active subject of research because they have such huge implications for sea level around the globe. And another one of the really interesting aspects of Greenland melting um, is that the ice sheet itself is so massive that it exerts a pretty significant gravitational pull. So as you melt Greenland, you actually tend to, um, the way that sea level is distributed around the world is not even because of that.
Yeah, no, and while you were saying that, I do want people to know, like, there's the human aspect of all these stories too, because I learned a lot about Greenland that I didn't know before, with the Danish and the complexities and the indigenous peoples there. So I know Greenland's been in the news the last year for certain reasons, but
Yes.
it, it's I always feel like we're the frog in the pot, and the heat is getting hotter and hotter, and we just don't realize it's boiling yet, and we're almost there. But there is hope in there, and I'm going to get to there in a second. Um, so in a follow-on chapter, there is hope. So you talk about Dr. Stephen Long and his work in photosynthesis, which I found just absolutely fascinating. Uh, and Science is so important. I mean, being a scientist myself, and David Lipsky, I put his book behind me on purpose because I interviewed him over a year ago, and he was telling me that a prominent U.S. senator, a Democrat, when he was talking to them about climate change, they shared with him that the government was all hoping for some gadget, right, to save us all. That's going to help reduce emissions and carbon and stuff. And I said, that's great, but we're not funding science. So when I read something like Stephen Long, looking at photosynthesis and really understanding it and being able to maybe change that to help feed the world. Why did you include him in there? And where are we with his work? Like, what really inspired you? Because I want you to talk about it, but I just found that part just wow. And then it kind of made me, like, we need to fund more science. Like, we just do. That's going to help us get out of this mess, like somebody like him.
Well, his work was being financed in good part by the Gates Foundation at that point that I visited, which is a few years ago already. And the idea behind that project, which is a really fascinating one, is that photosynthesis, which is this, super complicated um, process, is not terribly efficient, evolved over many, many, long, 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 long time ago. And, um, you know, as Stephen said to me, I can't remember exactly, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it's like, evolution, it just has to be good enough, it has to be good enough to
Hmm.
to survive to the next
Hmm.
generation. But in terms of, crops, it can be quite inefficient. There's a lot of sunlight hitting that plant, that crop plant that is not being converted into usable energy for humans or animals. And if you could just boost that a little bit, you would really boost agricultural productivity a lot. Now, that being said, as I believe Stephen would be the first person to say, that's a lot easier said than done. That's
Hmm.
it's get to
Yeah.
be real when you tinker with these really complicated systems. You know, the odds of improving them, the odds of doing something that make things less efficient are much higher than the odds of improving them. They had found a couple things that they thought were promising that they were pursuing.
But it was still, to me, it gives me hope knowing that part of science, not knowing as much that part of science, somebody's out there looking for solutions. Like that's what we talk about, like to give hope. And there is a quote in here I want to read from Bill Gates because it really hit me hard when I read it. And again, as a scientist, I feel that's like we need to fund as much science as we can, and we need it doesn't need to be a partisan issue. It's science got us to the moon. Science has me talking to you halfway around the world. Science, we just talked about the green sea turtle, has brought that back from the brink of extinction. So it is really important. But in it, because talking about GMOs and people's aversion to that, when you wrote that Bill Gates said, well, things might change if these predictions of food shortages come to pass. And if they do come to pass, it's going to be too late to do this research. So we have to do the research now. So, hopefully it doesn't come to pass. That's what we hope for. But if it does, at least we have the research behind to say, hey, here's solutions. Here's how we mitigate damage. Here's how we lessen the impacts. So I thought, found that very, very impactful. The next one I want to talk to you about real quick. It's just there's so many stories in here, right? There's just so many, and I without giving away the whole book, it's just I had to pick and choose a few of them. One that had me really laughing was your stories about beekeeping, because I've had beehives, and I know they're challenging. They are challenging to make sure they don't swarm, and then if you do get varroa mites or wax moths, all of these things. But then you had bears, which I didn't have to deal with in Florida. So it
Yeah, the
seems like
bear
you saw, yeah.
the bears found the hives. We had we just had one hive, and the bears found it, right away, and they are really hungry at the beginning of spring, when they come out of hibernation, and there's not a lot for them to eat. They people always say bears like honey, but bears really like, bee larvae, and so
Hmm.
they were all over this hive, like, and it was an endless struggle, and I will be yeah, and so anyway, my husband devised this, clever system where we actually hung the hive from a tree, believe it or not, and they did survive the season that way, but and we did get some lovely honey, but they didn't survive the winter. It's hard in the part of the world I live in. I live in New England, and it's hard to get them through the winter. And I felt like I wasn't a good enough beekeeper to keep doing this. But if I do ever do it again, and I am sometimes tempted because it was really a lot of fun, and really fascinating. You have to get an electric fence. You have to put up an electric fence around your hives.
Yeah. You were talking about some of that, how to mitigate it, but it was in the chapter talking about colony collapse disorder, and I was there when in the midst of it, and my partner at the time, she is a honeybee researcher, and so I had some insight into it. But you really wrote a beautiful story about it, and again, the human side of it. These beekeepers losing their whole business. Where are we today? Because you do talk about a little bit in there. Do we still understand? I mean, do we have? Is it the neonicotinoids? Is it? All of them go into the almonds in California and spreading disease. I mean, really, what is causing this?
I that question I think is, sadly and somewhat shockingly, because a lot of good people, put their minds to it, unresolved, and it sort of seemed to be fading, and then this past winter, my understanding is, was really, really bad. I mean, winter is when beekeepers take a lot of losses, even those who are in, warmer climates than I'm in. Um, and then you don't have the bees to pollinate the crops in the spring. And this past winter, so 2024-25, I think, was a really bad winter for beekeepers. That that question unfortunately remains unresolved, and it's a super important one once again for food production because bees, honeybees, they're actually it's a pretty interesting story. People tend to think of bees as, native. They're not native. They're not native to North America, and they're not native to New Zealand. They're native to Europe. The particular kind of honeybee that has been, uh, you know, that's in hives all around the world, and um, they are almost livestock. They get trucked around, they get tended to, they get fed, and they are used to pollinate a large number. You mentioned almonds. They're crucial to the almond crop in California. They're crucial to blueberry crops. They're just um, you just don't have enough native pollinators for a lot of these crops, which are not native plants, if you don't truck in these honeybees. Apples often rely on um, honeybees that farmers have rented, orchard owners have rented. So it's a serious issue for agricultural production in many parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're critical to feeding the world and everything they do, and yeah, it's just one of those things where hopefully science can find some answers. Is there a story in? Well, I want to back up a little bit. Killing Mrs. Tiddlywinkle. That was before I go on to the next question. That one, living in New Zealand, I do see hedgehogs on the road, and I do see possums on the road, and if they're alive, I avoid them where some Kiwis just drive over them because they are invasive and they are destructive. They just are. I've seen a weasel a couple times run out in the road, and I slow down. That's just me. But talking about New Zealand when you came here, what did you learn about? And again, wrote beautiful story about, because I'm here, and everywhere you went, I was like, oh yeah, I was there too. But what did you learn about, the colonization and how we've impacted places like New Zealand that humans were not on until about 700 years ago?
Yeah, that was a really fascinating story. I had a great time
Mm-hmm.
in New Zealand. So, New Zealand, as you say, was one of the last large land masses on the world to be colonized by people. And the first people who arrived were the Maori, as you say, only about 700 years ago. And they brought with them rats, the Pacific rat, which probably already um, led to a big wave of extinctions about 700 years ago. Because New Zealand, what's really unusual about New Zealand is sort of birds stand in for mammals. It has this tremendous bird life and these really unusual birds, many of them flightless, or several of them, key ones, flightless. And one of the interesting things I learned writing that piece was that um, New Zealand's birds are stinky. They smell, and most other birds. So when there were no mammals on New Zealand, that was fine because birds hunt by sight, but mammals hunt by smell. And so as soon as they brought in rats and um, weasels who have very good noses, this became a huge problem. So literally, there was one project that I once read about. I can't remember if it made it into the story or not, but could we devise like a bird deodorant, to try to mask the
Mm-hmm.
smell? But the real problem is that both intentionally and unintentionally humans brought in, and this is accelerated, enormously once the British arrived, and they had these things called climatization societies where they purposely brought over stuff to make themselves, feel at home, like New Zealand didn't feel like home. And this, completely wrong-headed uh, effort has just wreaked absolute, ecological havoc in New Zealand, and the bird life uh, is very, very threatened. And so there's this movement, that was what I was reporting on, and it continues, as you know, to this day to make New Zealand predator free. That is sort of that might be a quixotic goal, but in the meantime, the Kiwis have gotten extremely good at eradicating rats and weasels from islands. So they're sort of tackling bigger and bigger islands. And then once they've gone through one of these islands, they can put some of the bird life back and use those as sort of refuges. And that's what they're doing. And in in that way, they have saved some spectacular birds from, and some not so spectacular birds from absolutely the edge of oblivion. I mean, I remember there was one species, they were down to like 6 individuals, and they managed to, save those. And then the most charismatic species that I encountered was a species called the kakapo, which is a flightless parrot, quite large bird. Um, Green, wonderfully beautiful and sort of comical looking, has this bulbous nose, and um, they used to be everywhere in New Zealand, and now they're restricted to these islands that have been de-ratted and de-weaseled. But there was one, I'm not sure if he's still alive, maybe Sirocco, who was, like, taken out on the road. He was sort of like a
Mhm,
rock
mhm.
star, so people could see a kakapo, because otherwise they
Yeah,
were never gonna
yeah.
see one.
Yeah, I think they were relocating them, the latest I heard. They were all escaping, so when you saw them, they were put in Sanctuary Mountain, and, like, the funniest story is a trucker going down the road, and he sees this big green parrot on the road, and
Right.
he stops. He knows it's a kakapo. He calls the police, DOC or Department of Conservation to come catch one of the males, because they're so cheeky. They climb up and hop over the fences that's protecting them, and you're like, "No!" So, but they are in Codfish Island now, because what's interesting about them is they only breed every few years when our remu trees are flourishing and fruiting, and that's this year. So this year's a
Oh,
big year for the kakapo. Yeah.
oh, good.
So it's breeding year for them, and hopefully the Codfish Island is way down there by Stewart Island. But yeah, I loved that chapter. You Abel Tasman, you got to see the South Island saddleback. Um, so we have some spectacular birds, but just to tie that story up, my in-laws are here visiting from the UK, and in where I live, around our house, I said, yeah, there's probably only 2 native species of birds that you'll see here. The tui that come around, you can't mistake them, and then our silver eyes. The rest of all, I said, oh, that's introduced from India, that's introduced in the UK, sparrows galore, starlings galore, all these beautiful birds that don't belong here. They don't. The myna from India, like, they don't belong here. But yeah, it's humans.
Well, they evolved to cope with, they have the defense mechanisms against, mammalian predators, that's the key.
Yeah, I've got Eurasian blackbirds right now nesting in my roof. We have a little corner, and we hear the chicks, and and let nature do its thing. But yeah, it is sad. It is sad for the natives that are here and getting squeezed out. Is there a story that we didn't cover that really you felt was one that you really wanted to highlight, but felt was really important that you covered in your latest book?
Well, one of the stories that I covered, which I also really liked, I think is a increasingly, I tried to look at people who are doing interesting and important work, and also, just sort of ideas that were worth getting out into the world. And idea that I covered was, and this was based in Florida, your old stomping grounds. People trying to give rights to nature, like if we flip this around, and didn't see only ourselves as the creatures with rights, would the world look different? And that is, I think an idea. Is it an idea whose time has come? I don't. I unfortunately probably not, but it is an idea that I think has more and more adherents, that we need to flip this script somehow, because we are not, obviously not caring for the natural world. And so that particular story involved a group, and it was just really a group of, people, ordinary people, I would say, um, who decided to try to give waterways in Florida rights. And they succeeded, but then were um, really, the well, I'll be frank and say the Florida business interests that they were interfering with certain real estate developments potentially, really just rushed to Tallahassee, the state capital, and squelched that, made sure that the state legislature preempted it. It was a preemption thing. And so, that was both a success story and a failure story, but it was a way to explore this really interesting idea.
Yeah, I found it. Yeah, it
New
was down
Zealand.
Peru.
I'm
Yeah, New
sorry.
Zealand. Yeah, New
New Zealand.
Zealand, Peru, the other countries. It's,
Yeah.
yeah, really pushing it, and
Ecuador.
because
Ecuador is a big,
Ecuador was, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, that was a fascinating chapter. It's just such a incredible book. A couple more questions, and then we'll finish up where people can learn more about you. But you've covered a lot. You've covered a lot of ground around the planet. You've spoken to a lot of experts. What gives you hope when you cover these stories? And you do cover some of them in the book, but you have worked tirelessly to write. Writing's not easy. Meeting
Thank you.
deadlines. It's not. It's not. I've written a book and a textbook, and that was it took me years. But what gives you hope when you're out there and you're covering these things and you are seeing the devastation and you are seeing the this is awful, but this gives me hope.
Yeah, well, I'm always out there with people who are trying to do something, even if it's simply learn about things. I guess at the end of the day, I mean, one of the interesting things about what I've my own work life is that I'm often out there, covering really, grim news about the planet, but I've in the process gotten to see some of the most spectacular, places on Earth, the Amazon rainforest, the Great Barrier Reef. Um, and I think what, gives me, I mean, hope is that the natural world, it is extremely resilient. It wouldn't be here if it weren't. And whenever you give it an opportunity to sort of bounce back, um, whenever you take the pressure off, uh, and that's the point behind, predator-free New Zealand. If we just got rid of these predators, a lot of these species would bounce back. Um, Mm. so whenever you take the pressures off, the natural world shows that it has this tremendous regenerative capacity. That being said, we're not taking the pressures off by and large. We're adding to them. And, I think that if I were going to say, one thing that humanity really needs to do is be cognizant of, and often it's very hard even to predict, when we change the world, we're not just changing it for ourselves, we're changing it for every other species on the planet. And most species, humans can adapt to things by inventing a new tool, or you go inside and you turn on the AC if you are affluent enough. But the natural world can't, and it can only evolve in response. And one of the other many ironies of what we're doing is that we're putting tremendous evolutionary pressure on the natural world, and a lot of the creatures who are going to do the best are probably the creatures that we don't particularly care for, like mosquitoes.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or jellyfish or some of these other things that, yeah, there's too many of them. It's out of balance. Last question is, what can people do? Or if you give advice to somebody, what would you advise them to do to be part of the solution?
Well, that's a tough thing. I mean, I do believe that we are not getting out of this by everyone carrying cotton tote bags or whatever. Although I advocate that don't
Hmm.
don't use plastic bags if you can avoid it.
Yeah.
But I think that, what we need to do is, and, this is on some level the exact opposite of what is actually happening. We need a politics that takes the rest of the world. And by that, I mean, I speak as an American now, although I'm not speaking to you from the US.
Yeah.
Um, I, we need a politics that takes the rest of the world, those that is other countries and other creatures, uh, into account, and that would be a first step. It's not like a solution, but before you do that, you're just running roughshod over everything, and that is exactly what's happening. And in fact, we in the U.S. or we were going to not discuss politics, but I will just briefly
Yeah. Yeah.
say we're
Yeah.
we're actually actively, turning back on a lot whatever efforts we made to sort of um, take other species into account.
That's happening in New Zealand. So well, I know politics, but elections do have consequences. And here, the Kiwis are upset that a lot of our protections are being threatened, or certain politicians are trying to roll them back in the name of making money and the
Right.
economy and things like that. And I'll tell you, Kiwis are not happy. They're not happy about it at all. So it is a complex, but the younger generation, I do have a lot of hope with them. I just want to be able to leave a world behind that isn't going to be as bad as it is can be, I guess. Is if we let these things just keep running amok, it's going to be a lot worse for, our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren. But there is hope in the book, and again, Life on a Little Known Planet. It is out on the 5th of November, right? Or 4th of November. It's 2025. I'm sure Amazon everywhere. It's going to be probably in the airports, just like the Six Extinction and your other books. But where could people learn more about you, social media, website, or anywhere else? Some of your other writing?
Yeah, I have a website, and I where could they learn more about me? Wikipedia. I don't know.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm on Blue Sky for anyone who's interested. I'm on Instagram, but I'm not the biggest social media person. I will be frank. Those of us who are still in print media are kind of, a little bit behind the eight ball there.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm there with you. I try to be, promoting stuff, but no, it was such a pleasure. It was such a pleasure, Elizabeth Kolbert, to have you on. I just want to say thank you. Your writing touched me. It literally inspired me. I think it did help drive this podcast, the foundation of this podcast. It did put a fire under me when I was doing research, and I felt like I had to do more, and I haven't lost that fire. So your writing's incredibly impactful. So thank you. Thank you on behalf of my listeners. Again, Life on a Little Known Planet, I can't recommend it enough. There is hope in there, but it really opens your eyes even wider to the world. So check it out. And Elizabeth, thank you again so much.
Well, thank you. And thanks for all you're doing to try to raise awareness.